Hey folks, in this video we're going to be discussing how to add zeros to Google Sheets pivot. So in our last video, we introduced how to nest a query within another query when using the pivot function in order to create a total column. And the problem that we met was an instance where we were unable to sum column 3 plus column 4 in order to get the total amount because the Google Sheets query pivot resulted in null values which could not be added to our numbers. So what we're going to learn in this video is how to add zeros into Google Sheets query pivot so that you can construct a totals column. In order to accomplish this, you are going to need to understand how to use query, query pivot, arrays, and array formulas. This video is not going to deep dive those topics. I will be linking videos that do discuss those more in length in the description below. You can also find them by going to my channel page. So what we're going to do today is we are going to walk through each step of what I call the zero solution. You could also call it the zero problem, where you take a query and add in zeros. So we are going to identify each step. The first step is going to be getting the header row. The second step is going to be getting the dimensions. The third step is getting the metrics, which is all of these numbers in here. The fourth step is adding zeros. And then our final step will be going back to this example tab and adding in the zeros in the exact way that we have in the end result tab. So the first step that we need to do is get the header. As we discussed in our array video, data in spreadsheets operates in arrays, right? So this row 1 is an array, the same way that column A is an array. They are vertical and horizontal data points that relate to one another. And you can use an array in order to stack data on top of each other or put it next to one another. So what we're going to do is deconstruct this set of data here, which is coming from a query function, by isolating the header row and then isolating the dimensions, the metrics, and adding in the zeros. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my base query, and we are going to use this base query in all 4 of the steps that we will take in collecting the header, the dimensions, the metrics, adding the zeros, and then combining them all together to get one collective data set. We're going to begin by isolating the header row. And the way that we accomplish this is by taking the limit statement and changing it to 0. This will result in isolation of the header. The next step that we need to take is to isolate the dimensions. So in our data set, we have 2 data points, columns A and C, country and month, which are being grouped together in order to generate our pivot. We are running the sum function on column D in order to get aggregations that align to columns A and C that are then pivoted by the values in column G. So what we need to do now is we need to isolate those 2 dimensions, column A and C, from our query. In order to do that, we are going to use a nested query. So we're going to open up another query statement outside of our main base query here. and we are going to add in a comma and a double quote. Now, again, when we go to our documentation in here, you can see that in our second query, if we delete that double quote and that comma, you can see we're moving it into our data section here. So effectively, we're treating this first query in here, the inner query, the nested query, as our data range. We're going to use a comma to move into our query statement, and we're going to use a double quote to begin our query statement. Now again, because we are using a virtual data range, meaning that our inner query, our nested query, does not physically exist outside of this statement here, we no longer have a GUI, a graphical user interface reference that we can make. We cannot call column A, B, C, D. We have to call column 1 and column 2. And the reason we're calling column 1 and column 2 is because we have 2-dimension columns. If we only had the date in here, then we would only call column 1. If we only had the country, then we would only call column 1. If we have country and date, then we will call column 1 and column 2. And then if we had a 3rd dimension, like a person's name, then that would be column 3. Because we have 2-dimension columns, we need to select column 1 and column 2. We are going to be using a new method called offset. And the way offset works is this enables you to change where you begin in your data set. So we're going to offset by 1 row, and then we are going to do a double quote, a comma, and as we discussed when we first introduced query, there are going to be the majority of cases you're going to want a header row. In this case, you do not want a header row because we've already isolated the header row that we want. So we're going to put in a 0 because we're saying we do not want a header. And now we're going to hit enter. And now you can see, instead of getting a header on top of here, I'm only getting dimensions, right? And I'm getting 25 dimensions because I limited my first query, my nested query, to 25 results. Now, I want to clarify what offset does, so I'm going to remove it so that you can see why it's necessary to offset by 1. If we do not offset and we put in a 0, we still get the header value in the data set. So what happened here is country has now become a result rather than a header. We want to get rid of that. So instead of, like if we have a 1 in here, right, then we're getting country and month. If we go to 0, we get just country. We need to offset that first row so that what appears as our first row is this Canada 2022 12-1. So you use offset in order to skip that country row and move into just your dimensions. We're now going to isolate the metrics. And this is going to be very similar to how we isolate the dimensions. We are going to use a nested query, and we are going to keep our base query. And you'll notice that we don't need to limit by 0 because we just want our results. The only instance where we are changing our nested query is when we are getting our header because we only want the header row. For the purposes of dimensions and metrics, it doesn't matter yet because you will remove the header row at the end of your statement. So we will select column 3 and column 4, and we will offset by 1. We will double quote and we will do a 0. You saw I did a 1 because that's a habit of mine, and we will hit enter. And now you can see we've isolated just the data points. And again, the reason that we are selecting column 3 and column 4 is because these are the numbers. And these are the columns that we want to add zeros to. So what we've done is we've isolated the header, we've isolated the dimensions, and now we've isolated the metrics. What we're going to do now is we're going to add zeros to those metrics. Now, before we do that, I want to introduce a new function that we have not previously used before. And that function is called n. And what n does is it returns the argument provided as a number. The important part of this is text is converted to 0 and errors are returned as is. So if you enter in the number 3, you'll see that we get the number 3. If you enter in nothing, you get an error because it was expecting one argument. If you enter in a name, you'll notice that it returns a 0. If we return a null value, you'll see we get a 0. N is able to process the null values that appear in the pivot of query and enter in a 0. So what we're going to do now is we are going to use our base query in order to isolate the metrics the same way that we just did. So we're going to select column 3, column 3, column 4. We're going to offset by 1, and we are going, muscle memory here, 0, right? So we want 0 headers, we want to offset by 1, and we just want columns 3 and 4 just as we did. Now what we want to do is we want to leverage an array formula because we want to apply n to our entire range, right? And then what's going to happen here is n is going to respond to all the cells in column 3 and column 4. When there are numbers, those numbers will return. When there are null values, they will be replaced by zeros. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close the double quote, or I'm going to close the parentheses on n, and I'm going to close the parentheses on my array formula. And now you'll see that I have zeros appearing where nulls previously had been. So I'm going to open up a new tab, and I'm going to call this Bringing It All Together so that you can kind of see what we did here, right? And to kind of keep things quick, I'm going to, I will be demonstrating how to put this all together, but for the time being, I just kind of want to put it all on one screen, right? So what we did first was we isolated the header row, right? And then we isolated the dimensions, right? So paste that in there. And then we got the metrics, and then we added 0. So you can see in this visualization here, we effectively have recreated that data set, including zeros that were previously missing. So now what we're going to do is we are going to leverage an array in order to combine this header row on top of both of these dimensions. So what we're going to do is we are going to use our curly bracket in order to take the header and stack it on top of the dimensions, which will appear next to the metrics. And as we've spoken about in previous videos, these arrays, the construction of these arrays, need to be balanced, right? So this header has 4 data points that are next to one another. The dimensions have 2 values, or 2 data points, and the metrics have 2 data points. So you'll use a comma to join the dimensions and the metrics together so that you can stack the header on top of it. It's kind of like building something out of Legos, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to our example, and we are going to add in all that stuff that we just did. So I'm going to give myself a little bit of space here. And you know what I'll do actually? I am going to just start from scratch so that we can do this together. Cool. So we have our base query here. And what we're going to do is we are going to add in a curly bracket. And we are going to limit to 0. And we are going to have 1 as our header. This is going to enable us to have a header row. And actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture this as my base. So I'm going to copy it just so I don't have to type that a bunch of times. So I am going to change this to 0. And now I'm going to add a semicolon because that will allow me to put things underneath it. And now I am going to write query. I am going to paste in my base query. I'm going to add a comma, double quote. I am going to select column 1, column 2, and then I'm going to offset by 1. And I'm going to do a double quote, comma, 0, and then I'm going to close my query. Now, if we hit enter right now, it will not work. It will break. First reason it will break is because we have an open curly brace and we didn't close it off. The second reason that it will not work is because right now we have 4 data points, column A, B, C, D, in our header, and we're stacking that on top of 2 columns for our dimensions. That is unequal. You will get an array literal error, which says you had an uneven amount of arrays, or unequal, or whatever it says in there. So what we need to do now is we need to use a comma so that we can then do an array formula, n, query, and then we can paste in our base query. So you can see this is the exact same thing that we have been working with the entire time. Now we're going to move into our comma, double quote, select, column 3, column 4, offset 1, double quote, comma, 0. Close the parentheses on our outer query, close the parentheses on n, close the parentheses on array formula. And now what we will do is we will close our curly brace, and what we should see is columns A, B, C, and D, with columns C and D having zeros where nulls had previously been. Cool, so we have success. Now what we can do is we can reestablish our outer query, right? So again, this giant array that we have built with a header, 2-dimension columns, 2 metric columns, will now enable us to query all of that data. So we are going to put a query on the outside of our curly braces, and then we're going to use a comma, double quote, and then we are going to select column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, column 3, plus column 4. And now what we'll be able to do is, and I'm going to add in a label, and I'm going to label column 3 plus column 4 as total. And I'm going to add a double quote, a comma, a 1, and I'm going to hit enter. And now you can see I've successfully created a total column because we no longer have null results in our query pivot. So we're able to add 68 plus 0 in order to get 68. So to recap what we accomplished today, we learned how to add zeros to Google Sheets query when using the pivot method. We isolated the header, we isolated 2-dimension columns, and we isolated 2 metric columns. Once we got our metric columns, we used an array formula and the end function in order to replace null values with zeros. Then we used an array where we took the header row and stacked it using a semicolon on top of column 1 and column 2, which we put next to column 3 and column 4 by using a comma. Once we recreated our data set with zeros in the place of nulls, we were able to use another query in order to select all 4 columns and to construct a new column that took the values in column 3 and added them to column 4. I hope you found this helpful. This was a really challenging concept for me to grasp when I first came into contact with it. I don't think it's the easiest thing to grasp, but I think once you do get a hang of it, it's very helpful to understand how to reconstruct data sets, because there are just going to be several instances where people give you information that you need to reconfigure in order to accomplish your desired result. I have other videos that discuss arrays, array formulas, and query more deeply. So if you are interested in that, please check out my channel. We are also going to be working on a dashboard build that leverages many of these concepts that I hope you find interesting and helpful. I'm always interested in feedback, so please hit up the comment section. And I wish you the best of luck on your data journey.